Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar at Statistics Solutions. My name is Justin D'Souza. I'm a quantitative specialist here at the company. During today's webinar, we are going to discuss quantitative research questions and hypotheses and the best way to frame those. We're going to send everyone a copy of the webinar and a copy of the PowerPoint. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box, and we'll be doing a question and answer session at the end of the session. And my colleague Sierra is putting some hyperlinks in the chat box for our company website if you'd like to check out our free dissertation resources and our webinar archive, in addition to a link to schedule a free consultation. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, I'll give an overview of what we provide at our company in terms of services. Then we'll look at quantitative research questions. We'll conclude with a summary and a Q&A session. Okay, on this slide, you can see all the different components of the dissertation that we assist with. We have three types of specialists at our company. We have statisticians who focus on quantitative research. We have qualitative experts who focus on phenomenology and case studies, things like that. And then we also have literature review specialists. So depending on where you are in the process, you may receive multiple specialists or potentially just one. It really depends on what chapter you're working on. So we can help you with topic development all the way through the end, which is, PowerPoints for your final defense and journal publications. So everything in between, which involves, narrowing down your research questions, figuring out what is the best statistical plan to address those questions, figuring out what instrumentation you could use, and then, pinpointing your population sample, calculating a minimum sample size requirement for your research. And then we can even crunch your numbers for you. If you just send us your data and if you send us your school's template, we can analyze the data in SPSS or our company software Intellectus, and we will provide an APA write-up for you. So if you have any questions about the services, you can schedule a free consultation using the link that Sierra provided in the chat box. You can also give us a call at 727-442-4290. On this slide, you can see the past webinars we've done and what webinars we will be doing in the future. So this is our company website. If you just go to webinars over here, you can see what webinars we will be doing in the future, and then you can view past recordings in the archive. And you can see all the different topics we cover, from intro all the way to discussion. This was the last one I did. So last week we discussed importing data into SPSS and data cleaning and management. So check those out. Okay, so for today's topic, we're focusing on quantitative research questions. It's important to lay the foundation for the difference between quantitative and qualitative. So wherever you see numbers or statistics, you're usually going to be using quantitative research. If you have hypotheses that you're trying to prove, usually you're going to be doing quantitative research and statistics. Qualitative research involves looking at open-ended responses, observing natural phenomenon. It's more open-ended, and interviews are usually conducted. Sometimes you do both. Some studies require quantitative and qualitative. If you're at the very beginning of the process, I would say just pick one. Merging quant and qual just adds a lot of time to the process. So try to pick just one method if that's possible. Then, once you've narrowed down your approach, you want to develop your research questions, but you first need to identify a research problem. So what is the gap in the literature? What are you contributing to your field that nothing has been done before? Or maybe you're extending off of a previous idea. There has to be something fairly unique with your study. So that has to be really the first step. You don't want to just draft research questions. You have to draft meaningful research questions for something that hasn't been tested in the past. Then you want to pinpoint your variables of interest. Are the variables numerically measurable? Are they multiple choice? Is it a fill in the blank response? Most variables will branch into three possibilities. You can have nominal variables, you can have continuous variables, or ordinal variables. So you want to pinpoint exactly what level of measurement your variable will be and what are the possible values for each of those variables. Then you need to identify if you're using a survey, a self-report survey, or are you using archival secondary data. Self-report surveys are usually Likert scale responses, strongly agree to strongly disagree, that sort of thing. Not always, but many times. And then archival data is usually data that already exists on a database, hospital records, census data, things like that. And then you can pinpoint your research design. These are the four most common branches of research designs that I see. And depending on what type of design you select, your research questions are going to be framed in a particular way. So we will take a look at each of these designs and what types of questions you could draft. First, we'll look at the descriptive and exploratory design. A descriptive exploratory design is more of a trend analysis. You're not trying to prove or disprove hypotheses. You actually don't even need hypotheses when you do a descriptive exploratory design. You're just trying to evaluate trends in a sample. So here are some sample questions. What are the trends in job satisfaction among teaching faculty, or what is the predominant leadership style used among managers? As you can see in these two questions, we're not trying to prove or disprove anything. We're just looking at how the sample responds to a survey in general. So when you do analyses like these, you can run descriptive statistics, such as frequencies and percentages, or means and standard deviations, to summarize how participants responded to the survey. Sometimes this is considered too simplistic for a dissertation. A lot of universities want to see inferential analyses, something that gives you a p-value for significance. But if your committee's on board with this approach, I would 100% say go with this method, because it's going to save you time. The next design is a correlational design. So correlational design is an umbrella concept. Think of it as at the top of the pyramid, and correlational research branches out into two possibilities. You can have correlational analyses, or you can have predictive regression analyses. So that can be a little confusing. You could be running regressions, and the design could still be considered correlational. Some universities will say use predictive instead of correlational. But the idea here is that correlational and regression analyses share many similarities. For correlational analyses, you don't need to have independent and dependent variables. You just need to have two variables of interest, two or more variables of interest, I should have said. So here we have some sample questions, and the overarching general template will be, is there a significant relationship or association between variable X and variable Y? Then you just substitute your variables of interest for X and Y here. And depending on the level of measurement for these variables, you can run a particular analysis. If you have two continuous level variables, two numeric variables that fall on a continuum or a scale, you can run Pearson correlations. If you have two variables that at least one has a multiple choice format and it's ordinal, something like education, where it goes up a ladder, bachelor's, master's, PhD. Or if you're looking at an individual Likert scale item from strongly agree to strongly disagree, that's when you can run Spearman correlations. I-squared test of independence, that's used when you have two categorical factors. So sample question 1 up here, is there a significant relationship between age and self-efficacy? You can most likely use a Pearson correlation for something like that if age is a fill-in-the-blank response and self-efficacy is a Likert scale response. So, self-efficacy, you could have 10 items that are measuring self-efficacy. And once you build a composite score, or you take an average of all 10 of those items, that new variable is continuous. So you can run Pearson correlations. The slightest change in how those are coded can change what analysis you run. So hypothetically, if age was a multiple choice response and not a fill-in-the-blank response, so if age was like they had to choose 18 to 24, then 25 to 30, and there are different age ranges, then you would do a Spearman correlation because that age variable is not continuous, it's multiple choice, and it's ordinal. The second example here, we have two categorical factors, education and job position. If you're looking at the relationship between two categorical factors, you do a chi-square test of independence. Here we can see the sample hypotheses that would accompany each of these research questions. You will have a null hypothesis and an alternative. The null is with a 0 here. The alternative has an A. They are phrased very similarly. The null hypothesis usually says there is not a significant relationship, whereas the alternative says there is a significant relationship, or we are expecting a significant relationship. So usually you're trying to disprove the null and prove that the alternative is true. Okay, so we covered one branch of the correlational family. The second branch is a predictive design or predictive analysis, which usually implies regression. Whenever you hear the word predict, you usually need to run a regression to test that relationship. And here we have some sample questions. Is there a significant predictive relationship between X and Y? It's very similar to the previous one. However, we added the word predictive right here. So predictive is the key word. And then you can see some sample questions. Usually you will have your predictor listed first and your criterion or your dependent variable listed second. So whatever you're trying to prove will be listed. Here we can see the most common regression approaches, and very similar to the correlations, depending on the level of measurement of your outcome variable, that is going to be the determination on what type of regression model you run. So if you have a continuous outcome or continuous dependent variable, you can run linear regressions. If you have an outcome that is dichotomous, something like passing or failing an exam, you can do a binary logistic regression. If your outcome has 2 or more possibilities, then you can use a multinomial logistic regression. So something like, kind of difficult to think of an example for this, it's kind of rare, but if you're trying to predict location in the US, or if you're trying to predict really anything that's categorical, gender, ethnicity, you don't always see demographics as outcomes, but that's an example. If something like that is your outcome, you can do a multinomial logistic regression. And then if you're trying to predict an ordinal outcome, just a single Likert scale item, you can do an ordinal logistic regression. The idea behind the hypotheses is exactly the same. You have a null that says there is not a significant predictive relationship. And then the alternative says that there is a significant predictive relationship. Just being careful to put that predictive language in there. Then the next design family are experimental, quasi-experimental, and causal comparative designs. So this is where you are comparing between groups. If you have a continuous variable or a numeric variable, and you're trying to assess for differences between groups, that's when you're doing experimental, quasi-experimental, causal comparative. These all fall into a similar family because you're testing for differences. But a true experimental design involves having treatment and control groups, and then doing a pre-test and a post-test. And you have random assignment of people into those groups. Quasi-experimental and causal comparative don't necessarily need to have random assignment, and group placement doesn't have to be done manually. So it could be, if you're assessing for differences in job satisfaction between males and females, that would be a causal comparative, potentially even a quasi-experimental design, because you are not manipulating gender. Gender is predefined. You are not placing participants into gender categories. So that's when you do not a true experimental design, but a similar experimental design. Okay, here we have some sample questions. The general phrasing for this is there a significant difference in Y, which is your dependent variable, between the groups of? And we can see 4 examples here. And each of these examples links to a particular analysis. So question 1 up here, is there a significant difference in job satisfaction between treatment and control groups? You could use an independent sample t-test for this, because you have job satisfaction, which is potentially a continuous variable if you're using a Likert scale survey. And then treatment and control, you only have 2 groups of comparison. So that would be an independent sample t-test. And ANOVA takes that idea of a t-test but extends it. So you can have more than 2 groups. For example, is there a significant difference in self-efficacy based on race? So race, that's going to have 3 or more possibilities. So you can do an ANOVA in that example. A MANOVA is very similar to an ANOVA, but the M stands for multivariate, which means you can have more than 1 dependent variable. So compare research question 2 to research question 3. They're very similar. However, in the third one, we have 3 dependent variables. We have emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. So if we're looking for differences across all 3 of these dependent variables between race, you can run a MANOVA. And then we add covariates. That's what the C stands for, and ANCOVA and MANCOVA. So this is an analysis of covariance, or a multivariate analysis of covariance. And all the C is a control variable that you are adding to your model to see if that causes any changes. So also not something I see very often, but it is an option. Here we have the hypotheses. And again, you have a null and alternative, same idea. You can see in sample question 2 here, we have 1 overarching question, but we branched the hypotheses into 3 because we need to look at each factor on its own. So you're going to have a separate p-value when you do a MANOVA. It's going to give you a separate p-value for emotional exhaustion, a separate p-value for depersonalization, and a separate p-value for personal accomplishment. So it's good to split them up. A longitudinal design is used when you're looking at differences over time, very common in the nursing field and for DMP projects if you're doing a pre and post. And you can also have treatment and control groups to make it a little more complicated. So that's when you do longitudinal, as if you have pre and post, essentially. And the sample question for this will be, is there a significant difference in your dependent variable between time 1 and time 2? So that could be pre-test and post-test. And here, again, each of these bullet points addresses the particular question above. So our first question is there a significant difference in knowledge between pre-test and post-test of an educational intervention? So something I should have mentioned before, this is making the assumption that the same participants are returning after doing an intervention. So they take a baseline or a pretest, you run your intervention, and then the same participants come back for a post-test. So for the first example up here, we have one dependent variable of knowledge, and we have 2 points in time, pre-test, post-test. That is when you can run a dependent or paired sample t-test. They mean the same thing. Then if you have more than 2 points in time, you have baseline, post-test, and a follow-up at some point in the future. That is when you can run a repeated measures ANOVA. So it's very similar to a t-test. It's just when you have 3 or more points in time, as opposed to just pre and post. And then the semi-complex example would be a mixed model ANOVA. So this is used when you're looking at a true experimental study, and it aligns with this question here. Is there a significant difference in knowledge over time and between groups? So you have a lot of moving parts there. You have pre, post, but you also have treatment and control groups. That's when you do a mixed model ANOVA. And we'll explain that more here. You can see the sample hypotheses. The first one is very similar to what we did before. However, the second example here is looking at that time and group examination. And usually when you do this, the most important thing is the interaction effect. So if you're looking at differences over time and by group, you have an interaction effect. So you have one hypothesis for time. Is there a difference between pre and post? And then you have a second hypothesis for testing differences between groups. Is there a difference between treatment and control group? And then you have a third, which is the interaction. So here you're looking at pre-test treatment, pre-test control versus post-test treatment and post-test control. So that illustrates the interaction effect, which is usually the most important when you're doing a mixed model ANOVA. All right, so in summary, you first need to identify your problem statement and the gap in the literature. Before you start framing research questions, there has to be a meaningful study to conduct. Then determine if you're using quantitative or qualitative approaches. Maybe you're doing a mixed method study and you need to do both. Pinpoint your variables of interest. Identify how each variable is going to be collected, whether it's on a self-report survey or archival data. Indicate if it's going to be nominal, ordinal, or interval. As you know, each of these is going to pinpoint a particular analysis that you can run. Then you can select your research design, which falls into one of these 4 categories, most likely. And then you can develop your research questions and hypotheses and figure out the best statistical plan to address those questions. This is something that I've found really helpful for students is when you're working on the methodology, develop a table of all your variables of interest, have a column for your variables, have a column for what research question it applies to, give the source of the data collection, what is the specific survey or archival data that you're using, what is the level of measurement, is it continuous, ordinal, or nominal? How is the variable being measured? Is it a composite score, meaning you're taking an average of items or a sum of items? Or are you just using raw data responses? You're not adding together responses, you're just looking at individual items. And then give the possible values. What can the scores range between? If it's categorical, what are the possibilities for that categorical factor? This helps to organize your research questions and your variables, and it keeps your committee on the same page. It's a nice organized way of displaying your variables of interest. Okay, so if we have any questions, you can type those into the chat box. You see we have some questions, and we're going to send everyone a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint. So we had a question from Julian. Are these services all free of charge for UWF students? I think you'll have to reach out to our self-schedule department. So Sierra put a hyperlink about scheduling. I don't think there's any university where it's completely free, but you can discuss with their team and we can give the best options to you. Okay, we have a question from Jane. What will be the sample population size for a dependent sample t-test and an ANOVA? I'll start moving the questions to a Word document so everybody can follow them. So what is the population size for a dependent sample t-test and ANOVA? So this is where you go into G-Power. G-Power is a free software for calculating power and a minimum sample size. So for a t-test, a dependent sample t-test, we go to the t-test family right here, and then we're going to do I have to find the right one right here. So dependent means, matched pairs. That just means the same participants are doing pre and post. And usually a two-tailed test is done, meaning you're not hypothesizing an increase or decrease in scores. You're just looking for a difference. And power is changed to 0.8 almost all the time. Then you click calculate, and it tells us right here what sample size should we target, and it says about 34 participants would be ideal to run this test. The ANOVA is going to be a little bit different because you need to know, first of all, you'll go to F-tests, and a simple ANOVA, one-way ANOVA will be right here. Change power to 0.8. This is the big part that changes. You have to know how many groups you're comparing. So, you know, if you had ethnicity and you're comparing white, Asian, Black, Hispanic, that would be 4 groups right here. And you would just put 4 and calculate, and it'll give you a sample size target. So that's 180 is our sample size target collectively. So that would be, you know, 180 divided by the 4 ethnicities. So you would ideally need 45 participants in each ethnic group. Right. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have a question from April. This is from April. In line with the sample size calculations, if you have completed your analysis, for example, an independent t-test, and you don't have significant results because you don't have enough participants, is there a way to calculate how many more you would have to get recorded to obtain a medium effect size? There's not really a clear-cut way of doing that. You kind of just have to play around with the numbers in G-Power. So if you go to, you know, you're trying to calculate effect, you're not trying to calculate sample size. So if we go to t-tests and independent sample t-test right here, meaning a 2-group comparison, let's say we're doing a 2-tailed test, we have to change this thing, this type of power analysis here. We don't want it a priori because you've already done the results, and instead, you want, let's see, most of the time you're doing post hoc power, but it sounds like you're trying to calculate effect right here. So compute required effect size. This is where you can just play around with the numbers, okay, and see if that will lead to a higher effect. Okay, we have a question over here. I don't have a name for this person. It says anonymous. So it says, is it possible to conduct an exploratory correlational design? For example, you've identified an understudied area of research. You could. I would call it one or the other personally. I would call it either an exploratory design or a correlational design. If you're planning to run any correlations, Pearson, Spearman, chi-squares, just eliminate the exploratory language and just call it a quantitative correlational design like that. I don't usually see exploratory correlational put together. All right, do we have any other questions? We have a question from Onesmus. What is your in-house statistical software? Do you use SAS or Excel? We use SPSS and Intellectus primarily. SPSS is, probably the more common software that's used in universities today to run statistics. But we also have our own company software that's called Intellectus Statistics. This is what it is. But this will give you APA write-ups, and you can clean your data. This is what it looks like, the data management editor. So you can clean your data, you can account for outliers, you can create composite scores, you can generate different plots, and then you can run the analyses. So we have a large variety of analyses you can run in Intellectus, and it's going to present an APA write-up for you automatically, checking assumptions and presenting the findings in a full APA format. So this is very useful. You just have to clean your data a little bit, and then you can run your analyses right here. But if this is not an option for you, we also use SPSS. Okay, I think Sierra can probably give you more guidance on the pricing. It is a lot cheaper than SPSS, that's for sure, and it's more efficient. So you can see it right here. If you go to Intellectus Statistics, I'll put it in the chat box here, which is the company website. And then go to pricing right here, and you can see the different options. So 85 per month for nonprofit, 125 per month for commercial use, and 59 per month for academic use. And we also give you a free trial. And yes, we will be sending everyone a copy of the recording. Hey, Rich, yeah, our studio is a great software as well. Not something I'm too strong with. I used it in college. I primarily use SPSS now. But yes, R is a very powerful tool. I cannot share that table because it's for another client that I'm working with. But I'll put the section headings in the chat box here, because I think that's the most important part. So you have variable, question, source of data collection, measurement. I'm just typing this into the chat box. Format. So those are the columns that you can use for that table. All right, do we have any other questions? Thanks for joining, Jane. All right, I'll stay on for a few more minutes if we have any additional questions. You're welcome. Thanks for joining, everyone. All right, we have a question from Oyarindi. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. What are the best analytical methods to be used when comparing weights of an experimental animal? It depends on how many animals or how many different species you're comparing. Most likely an ANOVA is what you could use here. So an ANOVA with your independent variable being animal type, and then your dependent variable would be weight, heat, something like that. It depends how many animals you're comparing, but most likely an ANOVA would be your best option. All right, do we have any other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. All right, thanks for joining, everyone. We'll send everyone a copy of the PowerPoint and the recording. Let us know if you have any questions and come join us for our future sessions. Have a great day. Take care.